everybody, it's Claire here from Sewn by Claire, and today I am going to be showing you how to fit a face lining, or to make a face lining first, and then how to fit that into a dress that you're making for yourself or for somebody else. So I've got my dress just here, and I've popped the zip in on the back, and we've got it all constructed. The lining's in the inside here. This is a Cashmerette Upton that I'm making, and I've scooped the back, scooped the neckline. I'm adding short sleeves to it, and I've got the gauge skirt on it, and it's also the princess seam bodice. But none of that really matters, because all you're interested in really is the edges that you want to have faced. In this case, it's round the scooped neckline and the scooped back. I'm not facing my sleeves. I'm not facing my lining or my skirt, so this is just purely really around a neckline and how to add it onto a neckline. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to tilt the camera down, because we need to look at the different finishing styles, because at this early stage, before you even go any further and put this together, you need to have decided how you actually want to finish your facing against your lining, and so that for the inside of your garment. So let's have a look at those options, and then I can talk you through them, and then you can choose what you want to do. So let's get ahead with that. Okay, so if you remember, we traced off our neckline facing piece from the pattern. We copied the neckline edge of our pattern piece. I then made mine 2.5 inches wide here, and then I then did a dotted line away from the neckline, following the same curve, and then joined that dash line together and cut it out. That gave me a paper pattern for my facing piece. The next thing then that I did was I went across to my fabric. Let me get the right one for the front here so that you can see that's the same. So I then cut one of those out in my fabric, and I then put that on top there so you can see that's exactly the same. And I interfaced that as well with a lightweight woven iron-on interfacing, just to give it a little bit of stiffness. So that's your neck facing bit. So this bit here, this curve here, matches exactly the neckline on your dress and on your lining. And then we've just got this depth here, which we're going to be working with. So I have then used this pink overlocking on the edge of my facing. If you're going to do a seam finish on your facing where you want to, that won't be seen, that edge, that raw edge, then you don't need to overlock it. I've just done it in advance. But again, let's talk through these different styles. So that's your facing piece that's going to attach onto the lining. There's 3 options actually that you have. The first one is that we lay that onto our lining. This, I've got my lining piece here. I've not done the shoulder seams, but I've done all of the other seams. And you will match this up at the shoulder, and you will match this wrong side of your facing piece to the right side of your lining, and you just match it along the edge of your lining, and that will then sit on there. Now this is if you want to have the exposed overlocking still visible, because what I would do then is, after I've pinned that on in place, so I'd probably pin the neckline first to make sure that's all sitting nice and flat first, and you've got all your raw edges together, because you don't want a baggy lining, so this should match absolutely perfectly. So you pin that all the way around here. And if you wish, you can go and put a little run of running stitches around there, if you wish. The reason why I say if you wish, because the next thing that we're going to do after that is we're then going to run a row of stitches just alongside this edge here for the overlocking. And you can go as close to the edge as you want to, it's up to you. And that will attach the lining, the facing piece, directly onto your lining. So we're going onto the right side of the lining, has the wrong side of the facing down. If you don't like that edge, you might prefer to do one of these other 2 edges, and that's why I'm saying you need to understand what, or have decided what you actually want to do for your lining first. So here's a jacket that I've done previously, and as you can see, I've got a line, a facing. I probably didn't make that quite deep enough on that one, and then on the edge of the facing piece, I've actually done a Hong Kong seam. So this is where you take a piece of bias tape, or in this case I just cut a piece of fabric on the bias. Now it needs to be on the bias because you're going to be curling it, so curving it, so you do need that to be on a bias. and then you then sew right sides together onto the facing piece, and then you flip it round to the back, and then you stitch down. And that's what I've done on this one here, just to hold that down so it goes down. And that encloses this raw edge for you. And then it sort of floats over the top of the lining. The same principle then applies once I've added that seam finish. I then go back to where I was here, and I just sit it on top of my lining, wrong side of the facing to right side of the lining, pin it in place along the neckline, and then I will stitch. In this case, I did my best to stitch in the ditch in order to then attach that facing on there. So that's a Hong Kong seam finish. Okay, and that does a really nice finish, especially in a jacket, because with a jacket you're going to actually see the inside of it when you take it off and put it on a chair, that type of thing, or you hold the jacket over your arm. You might well see that edge. So I wouldn't do an overlocked edge like this, a jacket like this, because you'll see it and it will just be a shame and a waste for that one. Let me just get the other garment for you, which is this one here. So you saw this dress on my other video about talking about facings. So because this is a dress, I'm happy for that overlocked edge to be seen, and in which case it would just get fixed onto there, and then I'd stitch in the ditch, and then that would attach the lining onto the front. You can then choose whether or not you then go back and take off some of the excess, this flap here of fabric, which is what lining fabric, which is why I said that you might not want to stitch down here first just as a holding exercise. You might just want to go ahead once you've got it pinned and stitch along your overlocking here just to hold that down, and that, you know, that's a perfectly nice and neat way to do it. If you want to do the Hong Kong seam, you're going to have to do that in front as well, and I realise I'm repeating myself, but I got interrupted in my recording, so apologies for that. I just want to make sure I've covered everything. Now, if we're wanting to attach this without seeing the edge, we need to be able to work out how much of the lining fabric we need to cut away in order that the curves are going to be the same at this point here. So what you need then is you need your seam gauge, and we're going to have a look. So we know that that is 1/4 inch. So if we went to, I don't want to go to 1/2 inch because I think that'll make the lining, the facing too small. But if we go to 4/8 inch, that'll be plenty, and that's 1 centimetre. Okay, so I know that I want to have a 1 centimetre seam allowance on here. This is 2.5, so that's 6.5 centimetres wide at that point there. Is it all the way down? Let me just check my, pretty much between 6.5 and 7. So if we want to allow for a 1 centimetre seam allowance on here as well, we need to be cutting this at 5.5 centimetres, because we want to have seam allowance on here and seam allowance on here. So what I'm trying to say is that whatever the width of your facing, you need to remove that amount except for whatever you want your seam allowance to be. So I want my seam allowance to be 1 centimetre. So this is coming out at 6.5 centimetres for my facing. So I'm going to cut off 5.5 centimetres of my lining fabric, because that will then, when we match it up, that will give us the 0.5 centimetre seam allowance that we need on both the facing and on the lining to make the curves match. So then you can take your Frixion pen or whatever you want to use, or a chalk pen if you want to use a chalk pen. Perhaps we use a chalk pencil because that would be a bit nicer. And then if you wanted to, also you can work on the back of your lining as well. Just so again you're not going to get any marks, and making sure that you're on the neck edge and you're not on the arm side edge. And I need to be in camera for you. So making sure that you're working on your neck edge. So this is my centre back here, I've got it upside down, this is my shoulder. Then I'm going to measure in 5.5 centimetres from the edge and put a mark. 5.5 centimetres in from the edge and then put another mark. And I'm doing the same technique that we used for making the facing in the first place. You can have your dashes as far apart or as close as you wish them to be to give you a nice smooth line. And I'm going to continue down and use the same measurement on all of my facing pieces. So it's going to get quite close to that seam just there, but just keep going. We are going to miss it, so don't worry. And all the way around, and I think you get the idea of what we're doing with this now. So 5.5. Be as accurate as you can with it. Make sure it's right. The old adage, measure twice and cut once, is definitely true, isn't it, in dressmaking as well. So just pop this lines down here and show you. And once you've got your dotted lines, then you can then, should you wish, go ahead and just join those together to give you a nice smooth cutting line that you're wanting to cut. The next thing then is the brave bit to do. If you're nervous about doing this, I would suggest that you stick with laying your facing over the top of your lining and just stitching the ditch until you get used to doing that. So if you're a beginner, that's where I would start with it. But this is another way of being a little bit more advanced. We're going to be quite close to this princess seam here, but we're going to carry on with it. So then once you've got this cut out like this, now if you want to do two together, if you find the other half of your bodice and you're making sure you've got your centre back, you can put those two edges together. So I'm matching that waist seam with a pin. So I'm making sure this is all going to all sit very, very still and steady for me. So I'm matching up those. Because you guessed it, you can cut it out once and have both the same. So let's pop this down on the side here. Match up our shoulder seams. Because again, unless you cut them out on the flat, they should match anyway. So I'm going to stitch I'm going to pin both sides. So I'm pinning. So I am pinning sort of before and after that line that we're going to be cutting to make sure that it's as neat and as even as possible. Put your raw edges together. And I know it might feel like a bit of a waste, but if you want to draw out, and it is, I'm not going to say it's not, but you can save these little bits of fabric for different projects. But if you wanted to, and you know you're going to be doing this dress time and time again, it's one of your tried and true dresses, then what you could do is you could make yourself bespoke lining pieces. You'd do exactly the same as this, but with your paper, a duplicate copy of your bodice pattern, and then you would then be able to measure down, you know, for your facing, but then come back a little bit to add your seam allowance on. It's just remembering about that seam allowance, because you can't cut off 2.5 inches, because then you've got nothing to attach your facing to. If you cut off 2.5 inches, you're at the edge of your facing, so you wouldn't then have any seam allowance. So you've got to measure down and then come back a bit, so less the seam allowance. So you've got that little overlap, and that's what's going to make it work for you when you come to sew these together. I'm making it probably sound a little bit more complicated than it actually is, and apologies for that. It's just I'm trying to think on my feet as I'm talking to you. And all I'm going to do now is take my scissors and cut out this back lining piece, making sure that you're only cutting through your two pieces of the back and that you're not got anything else trapped underneath your lining as you're cutting that out. Don't try and cut over your pins, it doesn't work. Okay, so that's taken that off there, and if we lay that on top, we can see that that's the same width minus our centimetre that we wanted. So we know that I can breathe a sigh of relief. I know I've not taken off too much. So let's just take this apart now, take the pins out, pop those in my pin cushion. And I'm going to put that to one side because I don't need it. But what I do need now is we're going to be sewing a seam a bit similar to a princess seam in that it's curved. So let's get our orientation of our bodice correct again, because we're going to put in right sides together for this. So now, to make sure that you've got the right section of your facing piece, if you lay out your tops, there's my centre back and my waist, here's my shoulder just up here. This facing piece is going to slot in along there. So you can't take the piece that you had already and try and fix it, because that's the wrong edge that you're going to be fixing. It's this edge here that you're fixing. So that's why if you lay it with your lining facing up and you're facing up, oh, it gets a bit complicated, doesn't it? Then we know that that's the right orientation and those are the right curves that we're trying to fit together. The problem is that when you flip the facing over and start to attach it to your lining, we need that centre back to be straight, don't we? And we've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance to be doing there. As you start to try and fit this together, you're going to feel like it's going wrong, just because those seams are counter to each other. Because what you're actually going to be doing is twisting this seam here, this facing and the lining round, excuse the road noise, twisting the facing around here to fit that curve. So as you can see, as we start to put this together, you can see the two curves are at opposite ways. But when we then turn this over, can you see how that's getting set in very nicely and is going to sit in there just beautifully? So that's so I was just mimicking with the pins, the stitched edge. So you're going to carry on and do that. So I would pin a certain so far, and I would also pin at the top of the shoulder, because that's your reference point. That's got to match, hasn't it? We need this to be an extension of the shoulder piece so that that will fit together nicely. Let's put a pin in there. And you can pin it all the way down, but you might find it easier just to put the edges together. As you're starting to put it together, you'll feel that whether it's right or wrong. All the way down here. And I'm just going to have to just be really careful with that seam just there, because if I take it too much. So I'm going to put a double pin at the point at which I need to be really careful, because that'll remind me at the start and the stop that we've not got much seam allowance there, and I've got to take it nice and slow. If you've got a straightforward darted bodice, you're still going to do the same thing that we've been doing here, except you won't have to worry about this princess seam coming in here where I've got that extra seam allowance. So let's pin that onto there. Pull that away in the back just to make sure that that's staying out the way. And then it starts to get narrow from here, so if I put another double pin just there, that will remind me. So this section here, between those two sets of double pins, is just my warning that I've got to be really careful with this seam allowance just here. I'm going to smoosh that down. We don't want any puckers in it if we can help it. It's not the end of the world if we do, because it is a lining, but if you want it to be absolutely precise, then you need to try and not get any puckers in it whilst you're sewing this together. Okay, so I have that facing pinned on. We've got it going to the different ways, and because, I mean, you can choose to sew from the other side if you wish to, from the lining side, it's up to you, but when we fold that back you can see how that's going to fit along that neckline edge and look really nice. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine now, and I'm going to start and sew down here. I'm going to use just an ordinary construction stitch, and I'm just going to sew that 1 centimetre seam allowance that we've allowed. If we sew any more than that, we're going to make our lining smaller than a dress. If we sew less than that, we're going to make the lining baggy inside the dress. So we're looking to try and hit that 1 centimetre mark perfectly. And this is the same for all of your facings. You're going to do this on all of your pieces round. This is one back neckline. I'm going to do the other side of the back neckline exactly the same way as I've just done this one. And then I'm going to repeat the process, but I've not trimmed it yet. I'm going to fold my centre front in half like this, so I get my curve nice and even. I'm going to then pin that, and I'm going to mark it again at the 5.5 centimetres that we've taken off for our facing. I'll then pin my centre front facing in the same way, but I'll match my shoulder tops, and I will notch the edge of my, or just put a pin in to note where the centre of the facing is, and I will make sure that the centre is on the centre first and the shoulders finish at the shoulders before I then start pinning. And if there's any difference between the two, I'll just ease that in as I'm sewing. Okay, I hope that all makes sense so far. Let me get on with sewing this into place for you and showing you that. So I have my machine loaded up with my black thread because that's what I've been using for my general construction. I'm then matching this up to the 1 centimetre mark on the raw edges of my fabric, finding my pedal, and I am just going to sew that through. And I'm going to put my needle in my work because we will be pivoting and we will be adjusting as we are. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that everything's all nice and flat under the first couple of inches of my facing, to make sure that's lying all lovely and flat. Take my pins out as I go. We don't sew over pins. And if we need to stop, we just stop and just readjust this. I'm just taking it nice and slow and nice and steady. I'm putting some pressure on my facing and my lining this side, and it's just going around that curve just nice and gently. If you have to, you can stop with your needle in your work and lift up your presser foot, and then you can pivot your work. Don't lift your presser foot up though unless you've got your needle in your work, because that's what anchors it all down for you. Coming up to another pin, let's take that one out. And we'll just carry on in the same manner until we get to that double pin, where we're going to take a little bit more care and attention. Even more care, should I say, because we're already taking care and attention, aren't we? So we're at the point of the double pin here. So I'm now just going to check that everything's out of the way, and I'm going to be really, really careful on that seam allowance. Just keep pulling your facing and make sure that everything's all out of the way on the other side without pulling your facing away from your edge. You still need your raw edges together. I'm just going to lift my presser foot up and just sweep underneath, just to make sure that everything's all sitting all nicely. Just got a little bit of a bunching up going on. So again, just readjust that. Coming out of the danger period now, because we've got all of this set up nicely. Take those pins out now. And this should then just sit nicely underneath there. Reverse stitch at the start and the end. Okay, let's take our threads off and let's have a little look and see how we've done. I'm just going to machine it out of the way. Take our threads off at the beginning. Oops, gosh, sorry. I'm wrecking the place. And then if we have a look at our lining here, we can see that we've got our fabric all laid in nicely there. That's my princess seam there. It's not a pucker, so I was happy with that. And then the lining is, so rather than fold your facing up and fold your lining, oops, rather than fold your you're facing up like that on the edge, let your facing lie flat, because the lining is much lighter and more flexible than your facing edge, and so it's just a lot easier to have that facing lying flat. It'll be a lot less bulky under your garment than if you try and press that facing edge up. So for me, I always have my facing down towards my lining. Even if you see it a little bit through, I don't mind that, because I know that's going to sit so much nicer now. Next thing to do then is to give this a quick press. The first thing I'm going to do is adjust the temperature on my iron, because I don't want to melt any of my lining or adjust it or affect it at all. So let's just take some of the heat off there, and I'm just going to press gently over the edge of this lining here, just to set those stitches. And then once I've done that, we can then use a press cloth, and I like to use a silk organza press cloth, and I'm going to just pull gently on the lining just to pull it away from the facing a little bit, and then just press a little bit at a time, and just working nice and slowly, just pulling that facing out to give it a nice edge. And as you can see, that's lying really nice and flat now. I'm just working up my way up the top of the facing here. Keep my hands out of the way of the iron, but underneath, so I can help that sit nicely. The lining fabric does press nicely when it's all in there. Use a little bit of steam if you wish. Just not got any water in my iron at the moment. As we can see, that's put a lovely lining, this lovely edge onto our lining now. So once you've done that, we'll go back and we'll now put this onto our, as I say, onto the other side of the lining, on the other on the neckline edge, and then the centre neckline edge, and that will then give us the finish that we want for where we're going to be going forward. So exactly the same way. So I'll just go and do that. Rewind the video if you need to see it again. Hopefully I've edited it to make sense so that it all does follow nicely, and then I'll come back to you when we're ready to fit this into the garment. Oh no, the other thing that we're going to do is sew the shoulder seam. So once you've got the facings onto both, I'll come back and show you how I do that. Okay. Just another little tip that I've found as well as I'm doing this, and I'm doing it automatically, and then I realised that I'd not probably shown you how to do this little bit as well, is that when you are sewing and as things start to get bunched up and you start to get ripples in your lining underneath, don't underestimate the power of a swoosh, okay? And in saying that, what I mean is that leave your needle in the work, lift up the foot, and then sweep your hand underneath and just take all of this excess fabric back and out the way. And what it does is it just smooths the next inch or two under your presser foot. So here I've got another bunch that's coming up that might well form a pucker. So if I do that swooshing motion, I can then feel with my fingers in front of my presser foot that everything's all nice and neat. Pop my presser foot back down again and sew that section. And then I take a break again, lift my presser foot up and just take that excess fabric back here that's all bunched up. I'm not tugging it away from the raw edges are still together, but you're just swooshing the fabric underneath, and it really does just help everything, especially on these tighter curves. It does just help everything just sit in place for you. So try not to swoosh, because if you swoosh too soon without your pins in, then you're going to knock your raw edges off together. Knock your raw edges off from being together, should I say. But as I say, if you just lift that presser foot up, do a little bit of a swoosh, make sure you've got your raw edges together, you'll be surprised how valuable that is in making you have, helping you to get a really lovely smooth finish on the edge. Okay, so I've just finished ironing this neckline edge on, and mostly I'm happy with it. I just had one little pucker, and would you believe it was on a straight bit? So all I'm going to do with that one, if you can see it just there, look, a little pucker in the fabric, is I'm just going to go back to a little way just a couple of stitches before the pucker started, and then I'm just going to take those stitches out, because again, you know, we can take the time to just put it right. It doesn't take much, does it? But if you've not taken them out before, then I thought you might want to see how it's done. So now I've ironed that crease in at the moment, so let's iron that crease back out again now that we've released the pressure on it. Get it nice and flat again. Just a couple more stitches. I think it doesn't want to lie flat just yet. But this is where the easing in comes in, because what we're trying to do is make something that's a little bit longer fit into an area that's a little bit shorter. And when I can run my fingers along it and it not bunch up and it, you know, the fibres do go together, then we can trim off those ends. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just before I've undone these stitches here. So I'm going to go back to about here, and then I'm just going to start stitching straight on top of that line. I'm not going to reverse, and then I'm going to stitch down, making sure that this is all lying all nice and flat. I might even put a little bit of steam or a little bit of water on that just to sort of get the fibres just to relax a little bit for me. And then I'm going to just stitch until just about a centimetre past it. There's no need to reverse stitch, because then there's no pressure on either lots of these stitches, so long as you're right on top of your stitch line. And then when we fold that back, that pucker will be gone and everything will lie lovely and flat. And that's what I want to do, because I've got 90% of it, well, 99% of it done without any puckers. So why would we leave that 1% in when we don't have to? So I'm just off to correct this bit now. Just move my iron out of the way. Move my wool pressing mat. Let's get my machine. And I'm going to sew from with the facing down onto my work surface now, just so that I can then move those fibres together, shrug them over. So straight on top of those stitches, about a centimetre in front. Needle in my work, because we want to just be easing this in as we go. So let's just keep some of that back. It's wanting to bunch up again, so we're just trying to just manipulate this so that it doesn't. I think it's going to, just because of the way that I have ironed that crease in. I shouldn't have ironed that crease in, but that's when I found it. So I'm just releasing off some of these other little stitches in ahead of it. And that will hopefully just mean that we can then sew and we will be all good. Let's press the foot up, just release the pressure. So I'm just right on top of those stitches. I didn't reverse, and I think I've done it. Let's have a little look now. So yeah, that's going to iron out. That's nice and smooth. That's just the residual. Let me just show you, just to prove to you that I'm not fibbing. So let's just press those stitches down at where they are first. And as you can see, I didn't reverse at all. I just overlapped the stitches and then press that out towards our lining. And there we go. No pucker anymore. So that's how I mend correct mine. The next stage that we're going to do then is we are going to take our, so identify where your arm side is. So in this case it's the area that isn't faced. And then what we want to do is we're going to try and get these to match up perfectly. So what I normally do is get a pin, and then we've got about a centimetre, 1.2 centimetre seam allowance, haven't we, on this shoulder. So I just go through just where the join of the facing is against the lining with my pin, and then I then take that same place on the other side, making sure that the sleeves do match, the shoulder seams do match. A little bit low with that one. Let me just go a little bit higher. That's it. And then if you push the two edges together so that the pin is just going straight through, you can then just take a little bite out of your pieces, and then you've got that seam match. I can always shave a little bit off my seam allowance if I need to, on either the neckline edge or on my facing edge, but I want it so that when you open this up, that looks almost continuous. and it does on there, if you can see, and that's how I get it that way. If you've got to have it right on that seam allowance point, and you've got to sew to the pin. You can't sew into the middle because you've not matched the middle. You've matched right where that pin goes into the work. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's do the other side, shall we, while we're here. So let's get these two edges, roughly sort of put them up together so that you've kind of got them in the right sort of area. But if you just try and put them against each other and then fold it back, you can see that it's very easy to get them slightly off. So let's do this again with this one. So about 1.2 centimetres down, and I'm going to go just through. So if I've caught up to the lining there, so I'm just going to fold that bit back again. Around about there. You can measure it if you wish and draw a line. And then I'm going to then do the same on this side and go through that point where the lining matches. Put those two sides together, and that's pretty good. Make sure your raw edges are matching. Make sure you pin straight through. I need to put another pin in just to hold that steady. And if we fold it back and have a little look at it, we can see where that pin goes through. That's a perfect match as well. So let's go to our sewing machine. Just sew this way through. And I know that I need my 1.2 centimetres for my seam allowance. So let's start and reverse. Needle in our work to hold that steady for us. And then we're going to aim for where the pin goes into that fabric just there, because that's our match point. Now I have carried on with my black thread. If you were an absolute perfectionist, you would sew up to that point and then stop, and then you would sew with your magenta thread thereafter, or your contrast thread thereafter, if you're using such a strong different thread colour as I have. So you can see we've lost a little bit of the seam allowance there, but we'll adjust for that when we're putting our lining in. But there we've got a perfect match on our seam just there, look. So I'm happy with that one. So let's carry on with this one. Keep your fingers crossed. I've got mine crossed. And open it up. And yeah, we've got another perfect match on there as well. So that is wonderful. So now all needs to happen is move our sewing machine out of the way. Let's just get our pressing mat. And I am just going to press these seams open, because that will then help us when we are inserting this into our dress. And congratulations, folks, you've just made a face lining. I'm just pressing these open. So I hope you're feeling very accomplished with yourselves for doing that. I think it's a lovely skill to have. So if I turn this round now, there we go. We've got the inside of our bodice. There's our facing all ready to go inside our dress. And if we look on the other side, there's our back facings ready to go into the back of our dress. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my dress together, and we're going to then pin this neckline, this facing, into the actual garment itself. So first thing I'm going to do now is just put these two shoulder seams together. And I just want to, if you haven't got a centre front notch already, I would suggest that you add one. So lay your lining all together and make sure everything's all straight together. I know I've not got one, so I'm just going to add one just there. And then do the same with your dress, because this is going to help you make sure that you've got all the fullness into the right section. So again, put your two shoulder seams together on your dress without pulling it. We don't want to pull this out. And you may have a row of stay stitching. I probably should have put a row of stay stitching on this neckline first before I started messing about with it, but I just forgot. So we're then going to take the lining and we're going to put the two right sides together, and we're going to match that centre notch that we've just cut in. That's there. Okay. Now I'm going to go up to my shoulder seams and I'm going to match my shoulder seams, keeping my seam allowances open, so that reduces any bulk in the shoulder seams. That's that one there. And then whilst I'm on this side, I'm just going to go over to the edge. I'm going to fold my zip out, my end out from my zip, so I've got my centre back together, and I'm just going to put that together for now, because this is just going to help us make sure this is all lying together all nice and neatly. And then gradually just working along, we are now going to just pin these two together. So it should sit perfectly on top. As I say, this one has got a little bit stretched out, I think, with me trying it on. And I do try my dresses on regularly when I am sewing them, because I think you can tweak so much just as you're going along, and that makes it much easier rather than get to the end and then realise it's not quite how you want it to be. So let's pop some more pins down here just to hold that all together for us. Keep those raw edges together. So that's one back seam done, or one back edge done. Let's go and do the other one now, because I like to do my backs first before I do the front, because that just makes sure that everything is all lining up as much as possible. So again here I've got the two shoulder seams, which you might not be able to see with this busy colourful print, but I can feel that those are on top of each other. And you can always run your lining along your seam line to make sure that you're happy with that. Oh, I just thought one other thing that I do generally do is I run a line of stitching around my armhole just inside the seam allowance, or the arm side I suppose it's called, because that gives me a turning line for when I want to then stitch this lining in. So we'll do that in a minute. Let's carry on with this neckline now for now, because really we're talking about the neckline, aren't we, on these? It's all just about trying to get a nice finish, isn't it, and take pleasure and pride and joy in what we're doing. And that's certainly how I feel. I get very excited as well towards the end. I want to get it finished, and that isn't always a good thing to be doing. So although I'm pinning past the tape of the zip, I'm not going to actually sew past that. I'm going to leave that just floating at the moment, because I want to get this neckline edge in and just make sure that's all right first. And what we'll be end up doing is we'll end up be folding that back and then wrapping the facing round, and then we'll be stitching across it with the facing folded, because then when you take that out, you get a lovely nice corner on your facing and on your top of your zip. But we're not doing that just yet. Another Tanya Bedina tip from Sewing Classes Derby, which is great. So this edge here now, so the straight edge is probably not very stretched out, so I'm just going to follow that down. With my pins, and we can already start to see we've got a little bit of a discrepancy here, and that's going to be on this edge here. So I'm just going to start and ease that in just gently, just by kind of manipulating the fibres so that they want to sit in the right place. Again, we definitely don't want any puckers on our neckline, so we're going to just take this nice and steady. And as you can see, with that easing in, if you can see there, I've got a bigger line here on my neckline of my dress, and there's the edge of my facing. But by being very careful with it and sort of smooshing those fibres together, we can spread that out and make sure that we're going to get this neckline sitting really nicely. And again, we've got quite a bit more there. So again, I'll smoosh it down so that we're not getting a pucker. And if I need to move any pins further up the sides, then I will do. Maybe that one just there, just a little bit. Okay. So although there's some ripples in the edge of my fabric along there, I'm confident that when I run my finger across that stitching line, all those fibres will lie flat and we won't get any puckers. So then I'm going to do exactly the same on this side. Going to come down this straight edge first a little way without pulling it down. I just want it just to lie flat together basically. Hope this is all making sense to you. If you are finding value in this video, I'd be really grateful if you'd click the thumbs up button if you don't mind. And also, if you're not a subscriber already, then please do consider subscribing to my channel. It doesn't cost you anything. It just means that you like the channel and you think that it's got some good content, and then that helps that helps YouTube push it out to more people who might find it of interest. So it's just a way of actually showing that you like the content. I do put up dressmaking videos. I've got these skill builder sets of videos as well, and I also do sew-alongs as well, where we sew at the same time if you want to, and you can see me making these garments from scratch. As I say, this one is just about the face lining today, but yeah, I'd really appreciate that. Okay, so I'm all pinned in. I've got to be careful not to stab myself with the pins, and then, as I say, I'm going to stop just before my zip here. So I'm not going to sew over the black, you can see there the black zip tape. I'm not going to sew over that at the moment. I'm just going to come a little way forward, and then I'm going to sew from here all the way around, and I'm going to use that swooshing as well, just to make sure that we've got the next bit under our presser foot is all flat, and then we're then going to put this in. I've also got my organza ribbon handy, which is this stuff here. I'll show you how I add that in as well, because I think that's a really interesting thing to do, to add in, it just stabilizes the neckline and stops it from stretching out. So put that to one side. Oops. Get my sewing machine. Start at this edge just here. Make sure the bulk of the dress is out of the way. And as I say, I'm going to be sewing at it's 1 centimetre on here. So I'll take that bottom pin out because we finished that one already, and then we're just going to do a couple of stitches and back, and then I'm just going to then put my needle into my work before I get to the next pin and take that out. Then just readjust yourself, just all the time, just take the time just to keep readjusting, and take your time as you're going round. Got some tight curves if you need to lift the presser foot up and just adjust. Just pivot, that's called pivoting. When you leave your needle in the work and lift your presser foot up. And then I'm just following the 1 centimetre edge because I don't want too much coming off this neckline. And then just adjust again. Making sure the raw edges are together. If your work starts to bunch up underneath, just lift your presser foot up and just release that pressure. Make sure you keep to an even seam allowance as well all the way around. You don't want to have one side of your neckline or your back out of sync with the other. They've got to be symmetrical. Raw edge just poking out there, so I'm just pulling it back into place. Pins out before we get to them, and again just readjust everything, just make sure everything's all where you want it to be. Don't know how people get on sewing ball gowns. This feels like a lot of fabric already. Stop just around about that zipper tape again. Not going to sew over it. You need to keep to your same seam allowance at the back here, because at the back of the zip, because that's going to dictate whether your dress finishes at the same place when you finish it off as well. just okay, let's needle out of our work and let's snip off. We'll have a little look. So the first thing we're going to have a look for is on the other side, and we're just going to follow that stitch line all the way through and make sure that there's no puckers on our dress. And so far so good, we're all good. Okay, that's good. Right, let me take off my starting threads as well. Let's move this out of the way. So if we have a look here, we've got our lining all sewn in with our facing on it, and when we pull it away we know we've got that all nicely sewn because we've got the no puckers on there on the inside at all on any of that neckline. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is there's a couple of things we've got to do. We have to snip into this neckline because it's a curve. We need to snip into it so that when we fold it over and then press it flat, that there's enough give in that seam that it'll all lie flat. And if you're not used to clipping your curved seams, that could be a bit of a game changer for you because it really does help. The other thing I want to do is I want to sew in this organza ribbon. Now if you think about it, necklines, when you're wearing a dress, if you're pulling it on, pulling it off, or if you're carrying young children, they can pull on your necklines, then sometimes they can stretch out of shape and then and not look very nice. So what we're actually going to do now is we're going to sew in this little very, very fine, very narrow silk organza ribbon so that we can, this has got no give in it at all, and so it actually holds that neckline as we've just sewn it. That's why we need to make sure it's right before we do. And what we want to do is that when we sew this in, I want it just to be on the edge. So I'm just going to probably sew it just a millimetre in from the stitch line that I've done. Because when I fold this over, I want this seam tape, if you like, to be sandwiched in between the seam allowance and the facing, because the next stitch thing we're going to do after that, after we've snipped into the seam allowance, is we're then going to understitch all of this neckline to make it lie perfectly flat. So my tip is don't put it on your dress side, because if you put that on your dress side, when you turn over, you might see or feel a little bit of that ribbon on your dress. But if you put it on the side of the facing and sew it over the top, well, just into the seam allowance of the facing, this side here. We won't snip through it when we snip our seam because this will give, but it just means that will be sandwiched between the seam allowance, because when you fold it back like that to understitch, between the seam allowance and the actual facing, and that will mean that it's absolutely invisible then, it's just hidden away inside. So let's get on and do that. Oh, I've just found a loose thread, let me just get rid of that. So all I do for that is take my machine again. I leave it connected to my reel and keep the reel one side of me. Go back to the beginning of the dress where we were. And then I just lay that that tape. Now, if you want to, you can match up so that you're matching the a mark on your presser foot. So let me just show you on my presser foot. So on my presser foot, oops, I've got a difference here between where the plastic and the metal is, and there's a line here that goes right across to my seam allowance. So I'm going to run the sewn line that I've already done along that edge there. Hopefully you can see that. And I'm going to set my needle to just like a millimetre or two just to one side. And that will mean then that as long as I line this point here up on my sewn line, then I'll always catch my ribbon. And it just makes it easier to follow. You won't have a wavy line then, because we don't want a wavy line if we can help it. So let's pop this on top here. And I'm just going to hold that in place. I'm not pinning it first. I'm just going to hold it, and I'm just holding it to the right hand side of the seam allowance. So I'm lining my presser foot up on the sewn line that I've just done, and then now I'm going to move my needle across so that it's going to be catching the ribbon, but only just. I'm not going to reverse stitch, we don't need to, it's just going to hold it in place. Oh, get the right presser foot. pulled my cable out. And I'm putting the edge of the ribbon up against the edge of the sewn line, and I'm just following it along. Put your needle in your work to hold that down. Do a bit at a time. I'm not putting any, I'm not pulling on the ribbon at all. I'm just holding it flat. And the two stitch lines are literally just a millimetre or two apart. But one's going through the ribbon and one's going through the, attaching the facing on, and one's attaching this ribbon on afterwards. And if you're careful, you can kind of manipulate your dress back so that it will sort of, so you can then get it straight around the corners. So if I can just show you just here, can you see those two lines of stitching? One's going right through the ribbon and the other one is on the facing. And then when we fold this back, we're not interfering with that facing stitch at all, because the other stitch is into the lining. So that just holds that down absolutely for us. And then when we have snipped into this, and then we do our understitching, it'll all be great. So I'm going to carry on with this. You don't need to watch me do all of this. You've seen what we're trying to achieve, and I'm sure you understand. So I'll come back to you when we're ready for snipping and understitching. Okay, so the next step then is to be underlining this dress. So all we do then is we're pulling away the fabric. I've got I can feel under the main body of the dress that there's nothing else under there other than that one layer of fabric. All of the seam allowances and all of the lining is pushed across to the right hand side. And what we do then is we take a nice gentle stitch and just take our time, because we don't want to go too close to the edge. We want to be about 1/8 of an inch to 2/8 of an inch away. Needle in your work when you stop, and then just do a bit and then readjust. And I have pressed the seam allowance across already on the underside, just so that does help it stay to the right side for you. But again, as you're just sewing, just feel with your fingers, and you'll tell if you've got anything under there that shouldn't be there. And you're just pulling the facing away from the dress so that it's sort of stretched out as much as possible without putting any tension on it, because my join line is down here. And as I say, I'm just stitching on the facing side, and that will just anchor that down for you. So if you think about it, this neckline has had 3 passes: once to sew the facing on, once to sew the ribbon on, and now to do the understitching. So that's going to be a nice and secure neckline for you. Might seem like a lot of effort, but if you try and do more than one action, so like if you try to put the ribbon on at the same time that you're sewing the facing down, in my experience, you might be a bit more adept at multitasking than me, but in my experience, it just means that you then risk messing it up basically, and then you end up spending more time having to go back and unpick it anyway. Just make sure on these shoulders that's all nice and neat. Take your time over the bulk of the seam. Just lift your presser foot up if you need to, and just make sure that everything, as I say, is just all under. And readjust your dress as you need to as well. So you're not making sure you've got a lot of fabric here, so make sure that you're not then going back. You're not going over anything that you shouldn't be, because again you'll need to go back and put it right. So just take your time. Okay, I'm going to carry on to the end of this. I'm not doing anything different to what you've already seen, and I'll come and speak to you at the end. So I've just finished my underlining and understitching, and then what I've actually done now is I've come back to the beginning. You know, if you remember, I said that we were going to do an invisible way of finishing. So what I do is I locate my thread that I started with and the one on the other side, and if you give the one on the inside a little tug, you'll get a little loop that pops up. Let me get my quick unpick, and that will then help. So you pull through the thread of the other one through from the other side, and if you use just the rounded edge of your quick unpick, you can pull that through. And what that means is that you won't be able to see on this design, but you've got a very flat edge. You've not reverse stitched over there and made a bulky edge. You've just left it nice and neat. And what I do then is I take those 2 threads and I knot them, usually about 3 times, just to be sure. And then you can just snip them off if you want to, leave about 1 centimetre, or you can thread the loose threads, the tails, on into a needle and then just run it along the inside the seam just to hide it. For now, I'm just going to snip mine off. I've left about 1 centimetre. Now, we still have got to finish off the tops of the zips, but you probably know how to do that already anyway. I'm going to fold my seam allowances round towards the back, and then stitch over the end there. I've got a little bit of ribbon left there, so making sure that's all nice and flat. That's why we don't understitch right up to the very edge. So if I just pop that under, so if I just do that again for you, so there's the 2 edges that I left open on the end of my facing. I'm working on the facing side, and I am going to fold back, roll back that zip right so I can feel the coil of the zip on the edge there. And then on top of that stitching, I'm just going to stitch this bit down. And then when we turn it round, it should, she says, if it works, and it should, hopefully. Oh, thread's got stuck. Now just be careful, because just hand crank it first, because you don't want to go through any of the metal bit at the top of the zip or any of the really hard plastic bit. And just go off and just go backwards and forwards a couple of times. You can take that off. And then when you fold this back out again, you've got a lovely neat edge at the top of your zip. And that's just neating that edge off for the lining, and then we will be stitching the lining down on the inside. But I'm going to finish the lesson for today because I'm short of time, so I do apologise, but I just think that you'll be able to know how to finish that off anyway. You can hand stitch it down, or you can attach it from the side here, from inside. Where are we? Get it to go the right way round for me. Pull that through again. Locate your zip tape through your lining. I've got quite a bit because I've taken mine in a bit on the back. And then you're just going to run a row of stitches along here. Leave enough at the bottom there to be able to fold that up, because not only do you want to fold that up, but also because I left the edge of my skirt lining free, then when that gets folded back, you'll want this to be folded inside as well. There is a longer video on my Cashmerette Upton dress where I show you how to finish off a lining on the inside, and then that will go over that way like that, and then you'll get a lovely neat finish all the way down your zip. Okay, but there's more on that on the Upton dress, which is why I'm not going to go into that today, so you can go back and have a look at that video. It was the turquoise blue dress, if you need to have a look at that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show you this edge, because now we've got all the understitching on. I'm just going to take this to the ironing board and press that. We've got a lovely crisp edge there, no puckering at all. It's going to sit really beautifully smooth. And then I'm going to pop the dress on just to show you, because actually the ultimate test of this is when it's on. Okay, so here we are. This is the finished neckline. So as we can see, that's sitting lovely and flat against my body. The back I haven't quite finished off at the centre back yet, but again, it's all sitting all nice and flat. It's really secure. I know that's not going to stretch out. So I'm going to add some lingerie straps onto the corner so that the dress will clip onto my bra straps. That'll be great. I've still got to turn my sleeves up, and I've got to finish off the garment on the inside. So, you know, I'm off to do that really and get it all finished, and then I can pop it into circulation for wearing. Apologies for the noises coming from upstairs. So I hope you've enjoyed this video with me. It's a bit of a strange one. I started off a bit hesitant, but hopefully you can see that the finished result is really fabulous. And I'll insert a picture just here of the bodice on the mannequin, just to show you this neckline from the inside and how it looks. But I think that you'll agree it's a really professional looking finish, and it just does just really secure that neckline and make sure that nothing is poking out, especially with where, I mean, the key here particularly was that I've got such that, you know, with having that shocking pink on the lining, it's just such a contrast. We didn't want any of that showing anywhere around on the neckline when it's pulling through. So I'll stop fiddling with it. So that's why a face neckline in this situation with that real shock contrast lining is really good, because if we'd have lined it right up to the front, up to the top, and not used that face lining, then there was a chance that at some stage, if you bend forward or what have you, you'd get a glimpse of the shocking pink from the inside. Whereas this way, if anything does, you know, if I do lean over or anything does start to gape, then we've got that lining on the inside there that just shows there. So hope you've enjoyed this. As I say, if you have enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I know that's really boring for everybody to say, but it's lovely to know that you're there and watching. And if you could give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, then I'd really appreciate that too. Thank you for sewing with me today. Have a great day, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you another day. Bye.